It started like any ordinary night, moonless, quiet, almost suffocating in its silence. But what unraveled at a gas station off a deserted Oregon highway was anything but ordinary. It was the kind of night that haunts a man years after it's passed, not because of what happened, but because of what almost didn't. Ethan Walker had never considered himself the sentimental type. 35, divorced from anything resembling emotional intimacy. Married to his work, founder of one of the fastest growing frozen food supply chains on the West Coast. People admired his composure, his relentless pragmatism, his neat life. But beneath that carefully managed exterior was a quiet awaken he never let himself name. He was just a man trying to outrun the shadow of silence he carried wherever he went. That night, his only intention was to stop for gas, maybe grab a hot dog, and sit in his car alone for 10 minutes before facing the whirlwind again. It was his ritual, a small rebellion against the life that demanded more of him than he sometimes felt he had left to give. But the silence broke, and when it did, it came in the form of a sharp, hateful voice. "Let the dog go, you freak." At first, Ethan didn't move. He heard it, registered it. He was tired, too tired, maybe too indifferent. But then came the laughter, the kind of shrill, mocking laughter that reminds you how cruel people can be when they think no one's watching, and that's when he saw her. She was small, slender frame, tattered clothes, long tangled hair glowing faintly beneath the station's flickering halogen lights. One hand clutched the collar of a trembling mutt. Her other hand was balled into a fist. She didn't yell, she didn't cower. She just stood there, staring down 3 boys twice her weight with a rage that didn't waver. Ethan felt it before he understood it, an ache in his chest. That strange feeling when someone else's pain collides with your own hidden scar. He stepped forward slowly, casually. From the tailgate of his truck, he pulled out the old hunting rifle he kept not for show, but for solitude. Holding it in one hand, he let his voice drop low, deliberate, with a mock politeness that was more terrifying than any threat. "All right, cut it out, boys. Let's not make this ugly." They froze. Boys like that only have courage in the dark, and only when no one calls their bluff. One by one, they backed away into the shadows. The girl didn't thank him right away. She just stared at him, holding the dog like it was the last living thing in her world. She didn't blink. He didn't speak. Then finally, she said, "Wow, you sure took your time." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know I was expected." There was a pause, brief, awkward, and then she smiled. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't flirtation. It was exhaustion, edged with sarcasm, the kind you learn from too many nights spent figuring out how to survive. She told him her name was Sophie, that the dog wasn't hers, that it had followed her since she gave it a piece of sausage outside a gas station for towns back. She wasn't headed anywhere in particular, she wasn't running, but she wasn't staying either. He offered her a ride. She didn't hesitate. "Isn't your mom supposed to tell you not to get into cars with strangers?" he asked. She told him her name was Sophie, that the dog wasn't hers, that it had followed her since she gave it a piece of sausage outside a gas station for towns back. She wasn't headed anywhere in particular, she wasn't running, but she wasn't staying either. He offered her a ride. She didn't hesitate. "Isn't your mom supposed to tell you not to get into cars with strangers?" he asked. He asked her age. She said 21. He didn't believe her until she showed him her ID. Then she told him the rest, not all at once, not with drama, but plainly, like the truth was just another weight she'd gotten used to carrying. Her mother was a nurse, always working, always tired. Her stepfather, Danny, was a mechanic with wandering hands and threats behind his smile. Cooked dinner, cleaned up, stayed quiet, until the day she didn't. She told her mother the truth. Her mother called her a liar. She said I was jealous. Said I was trying to ruin her happiness. Sophie murmured. "So, I left." She had no plan. Just a backpack, a little cash, and hoped that her real dad, whom she hadn't seen in years, might let her crash for a while. He didn't. His wife opened the door, kind but firm. "We're not a boarding house," she said. Sophie spent one night on their porch, then moved on. Now her backpack was gone. Stolen by jerks in a pickup who grabbed it right off her shoulder while she waited for a bus. No phone, no money, just the dog and the silence. "You're not afraid I'll hurt you?" Ethan asked. Sophie looked out the window. People who want to hurt you don't ask that question. That night, Ethan didn't take her to the shelter. He took her to his house, a quiet property with a small guest cottage he hadn't used in months. He didn't know why. Maybe it was guilt, maybe loneliness. Maybe something he hadn't admitted to himself yet. She offered to clean, cook, whatever it took to earn her stay. "Just tell me what to do," she said. "I work better when I know what's expected." He believed her, not because of what she said, but how she said it, calm, steady, like someone who had no room for disappointment anymore. That night, while Sophie slept on the couch with the dog curled at her feet, Ethan sat in the main house staring out into the dark woods. Something about her unsettled him, not in a bad way, but in a familiar way. He'd seen broken people before. Hell, he'd been one. But she didn't carry herself like a victim. She had that look the one people wear when they've already survived more than anyone should. And just like that, without quite knowing why, Ethan made the first decision that would change everything. If this story pulled you in even just a little, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life. Stories that stay with you, challenge you, and maybe even heal you. Reflective question. If you were in Sophie's shoes, would you have accepted a ride from Ethan that night? Oh yes, sometimes you have to trust your instincts, even with strangers. B. No, never trust anyone, no matter how kind they seem. Let us know your answer in the comments. Or B. Your thoughts matter more than you know. By the time Sophie had spent her second week on Ethan's property, the lines between guest and ghost began to blur. She moved quietly through the space like someone who had learned how not to disturb, always one step ahead of what needed to be done. Towels were folded before he asked, dishes cleaned before he noticed. The dog, who she had finally named Bandit, stayed loyally by her side, as if sensing they were both holding on to something invisible. Ethan hadn't offered her rules. In fact, he hadn't offered her much at all, other than the safety of not being asked questions. She didn't volunteer explanations either. Their arrangement was unspoken, and perhaps that was why it worked for now. There was something about the way she carried herself that Ethan couldn't ignore. She didn't seek attention, didn't try to charm or impress. She didn't perform gratitude the way so many did when they wanted to secure a place in your life. Instead, she simply existed in his space with a presence that was hauntingly calm. There was a depth in her eyes, like someone who had seen too much too early, but had already decided she wouldn't let it destroy her. Not yet. He watched her sometimes from the kitchen window. Mornings, when the fog rolled across the lawn, she would sit on the wooden steps of the guest house, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug she insisted on using. Bandit at her feet, her knees pulled to her chest, she would stare out into the trees, as if waiting for something or someone that never came. Ethan knew better than to assume she was healing just because she wasn't bleeding anymore. Some wounds never showed, some lingered just under the surface, waiting for the wrong moment to erupt. They didn't talk much, a few words here and there. She'd ask if he wanted his laundry done, and he'd nod. He'd ask if she needed anything from town, and she'd shake her head. But the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was a kind of understanding, like to people who'd both made peace with the idea that not everything needed to be said. But silence has a weight, and eventually, something always breaks it. One evening, the power went out during a thunderstorm. Not unusual in those parts, but it rattled Sophie more than she expected. Ethan heard the knock on his door just after 9. She stood there in her pajamas, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes wide in a way that betrayed more than just fear of lightning. "Can I just sit here?" she asked. He motioned toward the couch. She didn't need anything else. They sat in the dim glow of the fireplace for almost an hour without speaking. Then, softly, she said, "I used to hide in closets during storms. He never came looking for me, just waited until I came out." Ethan didn't ask who he was, he didn't need to. "You ever get scared?" she asked. "More often than I admit," he replied. It was the first truly honest moment between them. Not dramatic, not groundbreaking, but real. After that night, something shifted. Their quiet arrangement wasn't just about space or safety anymore. It became a rhythm, an unspoken dance of daily moments that slowly wove their lives together in tiny threads. She started leaving post-it notes on the fridge, out of milk, fed the dog, you should try sleeping more. They weren't sentimental. They were practical, but Ethan kept every single one in a drawer in the kitchen, like little relics of a presence he didn't yet understand but didn't want to lose. He found himself thinking about her during meetings, distracted during business calls, wondering if she'd eaten or if the faucet in the guest house had started leaking again. He told himself it was responsibility, that she was under his roof, and he was just being decent. But it was more than that, and he knew it. Sophie, for her part, began to relax slowly, cautiously. She started cooking in his kitchen instead of just hers. She'd make pancakes on Sundays, humming old songs under her breath. Sometimes she laughed at the television when she thought he wasn't listening. And once, when he walked into the room too quietly, he caught her sketching nothing remarkable, just Bandit lying in the grass. But the detail, the intimacy of the lines, said more about her inner world than any conversation ever had. Still, they didn't name what was happening, because naming it would give it weight. And weight was dangerous for people who had spent so long trying not to drown. There was one night Ethan came home late, rain again. He was soaked, tired, irritated from a botched deal and a long drive. He didn't expect anything. But when he opened the door, he found the lights on, the fireplace glowing, and a hot bowl of stew waiting on the table. No note, no fanfare, just presence. And in that moment, something inside him cracked, not in a painful way, but in the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. He didn't tell her thank you, not with words. But the next morning, she found her sketchbook replaced with a new leather-bound one, high-quality paper, a set of pencils she hadn't dared to buy for herself. There was no note, just a small sticker on the first page, draw something worth staying for. That's what they were to people who didn't know how to ask for love, but were slowly learning how to give it without permission. The arrangement, as strange as it may have seemed to anyone else, was never about convenience. It was about survival, to broken clocks learning how to tick again, not in sync, but side by side. And that was enough for now, because sometimes the quietest beginnings lead to the loudest changes. And the most important relationships begin not with declarations, but with silence that feels like home. It started with a question that wasn't really a question. They were sitting on the porch one late afternoon, Sophie curled up in the old rocking chair, sketching the silhouette of the barn against the setting sun. Ethan leaned on the railing, beer in hand, distracted by the heavy silence that had settled between them since his sister called. She's coming this weekend, he finally said, staring at the sky. With her husband and some friends. Sophie looked up, cautious. Okay, he hesitated, then added, they've been worried about me, since the divorce, since everything. They think I'm spiraling. Sophie offered a small nod but said nothing. He was spiraling, maybe, but quietly, like someone falling in a dream. They think I need to prove I've moved on, he continued, then turned to look at her. Would you pretend to be my fiancée? The air shifted. Sophie set the pencil down, slowly. You want me to lie to your family? Not lie, just, not correct them. She didn't respond immediately. She studied him instead. The man who had offered her shelter without question, who had let her live under his roof without demands. The man who never asked about the bruises beneath her calm or the stories behind her silence. And here he was, asking not for her past, not for her future, but for a small part in his illusion. I'll do it, she said, voice steady. But only if we agree on the terms, and just like that, the game began. The weekend arrived like a thunderstorm disguised as sunlight. Ethan's sister, Amanda, arrived in a white SUV that screamed perfection, husband in tow. Smiles rehearsed, eyes sharp. Sophie stood beside Ethan, a faint smile on her lips, her hand lightly touching his, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. She's stunning, Amanda whispered to Ethan later when Sophie was in the kitchen. You didn't say she was an artist. She's private, he answered, and he wasn't lying. The first night was a blur of wine and laughter and subtle interrogation. Sophie played her part with quiet grace. She told just enough truth to seem honest. Her love of sketching, her habit of drinking coffee at night, her dream of one day illustrating a children's book. But when the conversation turned to how they met, She looked at Ethan, and he filled in the gaps. Coffee shop, he said smoothly. She was sketching a kid chasing pigeons. I offered to buy her another latte when she spilled hers. The rest happened. It was a beautiful lie. Gentle, harmless, romantic, and it made Amanda soften just a little. But pretending is a dangerous thing, because the more you pretend, the more your heart starts to believe. The more you speak the lie, the more it begins to feel like truth. Sophie felt it in the quiet moments when Ethan opened the door for her without thinking, when his hand rested on the small of her back as they passed through rooms, when their eyes met across the table and lingered just a second too long. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, she sat on the couch with Ethan, wine in hand, toes curled beneath her. "I'm good at this," she said, not quite smiling. He glanced at her. "Too good? Do you ever wish it wasn't pretend?" His jaw tightened slightly. He didn't answer. "That's what makes this dangerous," she whispered, almost to herself. "You start to wish." Ethan finally looked at her. "Really looked to you." She shook her head. "I'm not ready to want anything real." "Neither am I." The silence between them then was heavier than any they'd known before. It wasn't avoidance, it was the weight of everything unsaid. The next day, Amanda pulled Sophie aside in the garden. "He's different with you," she said, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "Quieter, softer. He hasn't laughed like that in years." Sophie didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. "He deserves someone good," Amanda added. "Don't hurt him." That night, as Sophie lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling fan spin lazily above her, she felt something curl inside her chest, a dangerous, aching thing. This wasn't her life. This wasn't her man. But for a moment, she had belonged. She had been seen. On the final evening, as Amanda and her entourage prepared to leave, she hugged Sophie tight and said, "You two are going to make beautiful children." Sophie smiled, but something cracked inside her. After they left, Ethan and Sophie stood on the porch again, just like the first day. The sun was setting, but this time, it felt colder. "Thank you," he said, "for doing this." She nodded. It was nice. To play pretend, he looked at her, unsure. "That's all it was." Sophie took a breath. "I don't know, maybe not. But it can't be more." "Not yet," he nodded, slowly. "I understand. But understanding doesn't make it hurt less." She walked back to the guest house that night and didn't sleep. Neither did he, and that's the cruel truth about pretending. It awakens parts of you you thought were dead. And once they wake, they beg for more. This was never just a lie. It was a rehearsal for something real, and both of them knew they had delivered their lines too well. The only question now was, what happens when the curtain falls? It happened on an evening when everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The dishes were done, the air smelled of lemon soap, and the hum of the crickets seeped in through the cracked window. Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers idle tracing the rim of her glass, while Ethan leaned against the sink, arms folded, watching her in that familiar way, a gaze halfway between caution and quiet yearning. He spoke first. "My sister called again today. She wants to know if we've set a date." Sophie didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. The games they'd been playing had begun to unravel, not because they weren't good at pretending, but because they were too good at it. Pretending had become a rhythm, and with rhythm comes familiarity. And with familiarity, danger. She met his eyes. "You should tell her the truth." Ethan's jaw tightened, his silence louder than any confession. Sophie rose slowly and moved to the window, where the fading light pulled across the floor like spilled honey. "I can't keep doing this," she said. "It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to me." Ethan stepped forward, slowly. "I didn't ask you to stay." "No," she whispered, "but you never asked me to leave either." That was the beginning of the unraveling. The beginning of what needed to be said, even if it broke whatever fragile bond they had built between late-night wine, polite lies, and accidental touches. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice low and uneven. "You want truth, Sophie?" "Fine. The truth is, I started all of this because I wanted to shut them up. I wanted to look whole, even if I wasn't. I wanted to be someone who looked like he had it together. You gave me that. And at first, that's all it was." She didn't interrupt. She stood still, like a painting waiting for interpretation. "But then you started doing things I didn't expect," he said. Like remembering how I take my coffee, or hanging your sketches on the laundry room wall, or humming in the hallway when you thought I wasn't listening. His voice softened, but the weight in it was unmistakable. I started waking up and wondering if you'd already gone to the porch. I started thinking about what you'd be doing when I wasn't home. I started noticing that I was not pretending anymore. Sophie turned around slowly, tears in her eyes that hadn't fallen yet. I wasn't pretending either, she said. But I was hiding, because it's safer than hoping. Safer than thinking someone might actually want the real me, not the one dressed up in a fake engagement ring. Ethan stepped closer. I don't want the version we made up for them. I want you, the real you, the woman who barely speaks before her second cup of coffee, who cries during cartoons, who draws to survive. Sophie's breath caught, and what if the real me isn't enough? He reached out then, gently taking her hand. Then I'd rather have not enough, honestly, than have nothing at all. It was too much and not enough, all at once. The truth had been spoken, and like most truths between two wounded people, it didn't come dressed in poetry or perfect timing. It came raw and trembling, like a confession whispered in a church after years of silence. Sophie sat down at the table again, her hand still in his. I need time, she said, not because I don't believe you, but because I don't fully believe in myself yet. Ethan nodded. I can wait. Silence settled between them again, but this time it was full, not empty. It held the weight of honesty, the ache of possibility. Later that night, Sophie walked out to the porch, wrapped in a shawl, the moonlight tracing her face like a secret. Ethan joined her after a while, not saying anything, just sitting close enough to feel her warmth. No pretending, no performance, just two people brave enough to say what they really felt, and broken enough to know how rare that was. That was the revelation, not that they had fallen for each other, but that despite their scars, their doubts, and the fiction they'd built to shield themselves, something real had bloomed in the cracks. It didn't promise a perfect ending, but it was, finally, a beginning built on truth. It began not with grand declarations or fireworks of passion, but with the quiet settling of two hearts that had grown tired of pretending. There was no audience this time, no family waiting for wedding dates, no neighbors peeking through curtains. Just Ethan and Sophie, seated across from each other at a worn kitchen table, the scent of paint lingering faintly in the air and the soft hum of a life being carefully rebuilt. Sophie had moved her art studio into the sunroom. It wasn't much, just a corner with mismatched jars of brushes, tubes of acrylics, a cracked palette, and a standing easel she'd found at a garage sale, but it was hers. And more importantly, she used it. That was new. For years, painting had been something she did in the margins of life, half-finished sketches on napkins, a splash of color here and there on grocery lists. Now it had become breath. Now she painted every day, not because someone asked her to, not to sell or impress, but because it made her feel alive. Ethan, too, had changed in subtle but profound ways. He no longer filled silences with small talk or reached for his phone at every pause. He started listening. Not just hearing, but truly listening to her, to himself, to the world around him. He traded late-night bar visits for early morning runs. He planted herbs in a box by the window. He cooked meals that sometimes failed spectacularly, but always made her smile. They never announced that they were together. There was no need. The roles had shifted quietly from fiction to reality. She still had her own room, though she rarely slept in it anymore. He still called her roommate when introducing her to colleagues, but his hand always lingered a little longer on her back than necessary. What changed everything wasn't a kiss or a confession. It was a morning, a simple, ordinary morning. Sophie had gotten up early to sketch the sunrise. Wrapped in a thick cardigan, she sat barefoot on the porch, legs tucked under her, a steaming mug of coffee beside her. Ethan joined her quietly, handing her a slice of toast without saying a word. The sky blushed slowly into color, and she caught him watching her instead of the horizon. "What?" she asked, wiping a crumb from her lip. He shrugged. "Nothing. Just, I didn't know people could look like home." The words dropped between them like a stone in still water. No script, no performance, just raw, unscripted truth. She looked down at her sketchpad and whispered, I didn't know I wanted to be someone's home. That was the beginning, not of some perfect love story, but of a real one. The kind that grows not from fantasy, but from forgiveness. From the understanding that both of them were still healing in places they didn't yet have words for. That love, when it finally arrived, wouldn't fix them, but it could hold space for their brokenness. In time, they built small rituals together, Sunday morning pancakes, reading on the couch in comfortable silence, leaving little notes in lunch bags, some poetic, others ridiculous. They made room for each other's fears. When Sophie's hands shook before a local gallery showing, Ethan simply held them without saying a word. When Ethan froze upon seeing his ex at a grocery store, Sophie squeezed his arm and smiled as if to say, "You're not alone." They laughed laughed until tears ran down their cheeks about things that wouldn't make sense to anyone else. Like the time he mistook her paint thinner for mouthwash. Or when she brought home a stray cat that terrorized the furniture for a week before running off with one of his socks. They didn't talk about forever. They didn't need to. Each day became a kind of vow, a quiet choosing. Choosing to stay when it would be easier to run. Choosing to trust, even when the past whispered reasons not to. Choosing to grow, slowly, like ivy on a crumbling wall, resilient, rooted, and reaching for the sun. And one day, without fanfare, Sophie painted him. It wasn't a grand portrait, just his hands. Strong, imperfect, stained from gardening. The hands that had once gripped steering wheels too tightly. That had learned to be gentle, that had learned to hold, not control. She gave it to him without a word. He stared at it for a long time, then looked up with tears in his eyes and whispered, "I've never seen myself like this." She smiled. "That's how I see you." Love, at its best, does that. It mirrors back the version of ourselves we forget is possible. It reminds us we are worthy, not despite our bruises, but sometimes because of them. So no, their story didn't start with fireworks. It started with silence, with pretending, with pain. But it bloomed into something honest. Something tender, something worth staying for. And in that little house with the crooked shutters and the creaky floorboards, where two broken people had once staged a lie, love finally came to stay, quietly, steadily, unmistakably real. In the end, what began as a fabricated arrangement between two strangers slowly unfolded into something deeply real, a love not born from spark and perfection, but from quiet understanding and daily, intentional acts of care. Ethan and Sophie didn't find each other in some magical moment. They found each other in the spaces most people overlook. A shared laugh in the kitchen, the comfort of silence on the porch, the soft courage to speak a truth without fear of abandonment. Their journey reminds us that love, true, lasting love, isn't always loud. It doesn't need fireworks, declarations, or sweeping gestures. Often, it's gentle, it's patient. It chooses you again and again, not because of grand passion, but because of peace. It's the steady hand reaching out when your own are trembling. It's the choice to stay when the easier option would be to run. It's being seen in your most vulnerable state and still being cherished, not fixed, not changed, just accepted. This story, in its raw and quiet depth, speaks to something so many of us forget. Relationships are not built on moments, they are built on presence. Not the kind that simply fills space, but the kind that listens without judgment, sees without condition, and loves without performance. We live in a world addicted to fast answers, instant gratification, and superficial validation. We swipe through profiles, ghost through connections, and chase love that feels like a high rather than a home. But the truth is, real love isn't a chase, it's a cultivation. It's what happens when two people put down their armor and sit with one another in their honest humanity. Sophie began the story as a woman hiding behind silenced Ethan, as a man running from himself. But over time, in small and steady moments, they learned that love isn't about who you're expected to be, it's about who you become when you feel safe enough to be yourself. They built something true on the ruins of something pretend. And here is the lesson: you don't need a perfect past to deserve love. You don't need to have it all figured out to be worthy of connection. You just need the courage to show up imperfect, uncertain, and open. And that's the invitation for all of us. In your own life, whether you're in a relationship, seeking one, or recovering from one, ask yourself, are you showing up authentically? Are you creating space for love that heals instead of hides? Are you brave enough to build slowly, even when the world pushes you to rush? Because sometimes the most beautiful relationships aren't found. They're built one choice, one truth, one quiet morning at a time. Let me ask you this, when it comes to love, which do you believe is more important? A passion that burns bright, even if it fades fast. B. Peace that grows slow, even if it takes time. Please leave your answer in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and see what kind of love the world is longing for right now. And if this story resonated with you, if it touched even a small part of your heart, please consider subscribing to this channel. It means the world and helps us keep sharing stories that matter. I'm not young anymore, but I still believe in the power of storytelling to heal and guide. Your support, whether a subscription, a comment, or a small donation, makes it possible for me to continue this work, to leave something meaningful behind for the next generation. So, if you'd like to support, feel free to donate whatever you can. Every bit helps. Even the smallest gesture reminds me that this effort is not in vain. Together, we can keep bringing light to the quiet corners of the human heart.